And Jesus himself said that he did not come to do away with the law.
He will not take us out of this world if he does not want us to be contaminated by it.
This is the Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast with your hosts, Michael Campbell and Greg Howell.
Welcome to the Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast. We are going to be diving in with a pretty exciting guest that's coming into our studios today to just kind of share his background and his vast wisdom in Adventist history and historiography specifically. Michael, why don't you tell everybody who we're going to be talking to today?
Yeah, I'm just delighted to introduce Donald R. McAdams, who is a long-standing historian within the Adventist tradition. He comes richly prepared with a PhD in religious history from Duke University. And I also take a personal interest because I teach Adventist history at Southwestern Adventist University. And Dr. McAdams is one of our former presidents, I believe from 1975 to 1984. I was talking to a few of our our veteran faculty on campus, and we were having a discussion because we just had a new presidential search, a new president for our university. And I was listening in on a conversation. Who was the best loved president in the history of our institution? And hands down, Dr. McAdams, your name was mentioned as a relational president. You loved your students, and yet you held very high academic standards. And so just want to thank you for your exemplary leadership as well as your scholarship. We could go on talking about other things, which we will. We're going to talk about some of the articles you've published, some of your work in the field of Adventist historiography, but a word of warm welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure for me to be here.
Well, let's just dive right in, and just tell us a little bit about how you became interested in history. I know you went to Duke. How did you decide that you knew you wanted to be a historian?
Well, in some ways, I would attribute that to Joseph Grady Smoot.
Okay.
I loved history when I was young. During my high school years, I would walk to the public library, check out 3 books, usually history, and then they were due in 2 weeks, so I had to take them back, and then I would have an opportunity to check out 2 or 3 more. And I think during my high school years, I read a whole lot more that I got from the public library than I did from the assignments at Tacoma Academy in Tacoma Park, where I was a student. So I entered college already addicted to history and, fairly well read for an 18-year-old. But I was planning on becoming an attorney. So my goal was law school. And that continued to be my goal until the beginning of my junior year. We had a new professor on campus, Grady Smoot, from the University of Kentucky, not quite finished with his PhD yet. And Grady was a really good teacher and a very inspirational person, I would say more than anybody else other than my parents. He's been the major influence in my life. He was a mentor. And his history courses were really interesting. And he pointed out to me that I could actually get a job where people would pay me to read history and talk about it. And I thought, what a deal. You mean that people will just pay me to read this history and talk about it? So I abandoned thoughts of law school and instead applied for graduate school in history and ended up with a grant to go to Duke that paid my full tuition and living expenses for my entire experience at Duke.
Wow.
So how could one say no to that? And I would say Duke was challenging for me. I was good at what they had taught me to do at Columbia Union College, which was to read history books, understand them, write good reviews, and write essay questions. I really had no training in research and understanding really what the difference was between just putting together a bunch of facts and really understanding the past with a thesis and some, presentation of evidence to support that thesis. So I found graduate school very exciting. I chose British history, spent a year in London gathering material for my dissertation. I wrote on 18th century British politics. What actually got me started in Adventist history was that My second year there, I was taking a course in the French Revolution. My areas of specialty were 18th century British history, French Revolution, American history, and then also I had a field in 20th century Russia. So I was taking a course in the French Revolution from a professor named Francis Ackham. And at the same time, the local Durham church was having an evangelistic series by an evangelist named Archer Livengood. And being a good loyal Adventist and enjoying my relationships with the small Durham church, about 60 members, I went to the meetings. Even took one of my friends, got a couple that lived near us, a young man getting a PhD in physiology. And Elder Livengood got up front and started talking about the French Revolution one night, and he was just wrong on the facts. So afterwards, I went up very politely and said, Elder Livengood, very interesting in all this, but your comments on the French Revolution, some of them are just factually not true. He said, come with me, young man. He took me to his travel trailer, which he had behind the church. He was a one-man show. He and his wife, she played the piano, he sang, he preached. And he pulled Great Controversy off the shelf and read to me directly from Great Controversy the things he had been saying. And right off, I knew there was a problem. And I knew that someday I would need to get into that and figure it out, but it was for later. That's when I first realized that Adventist history was really unknown and there was a lot of work to be done. So I ended up at Andrews University, and I had the good fortune of being there in the 70s. I arrived there in 1967, and Andrews University in the late 60s and 70s was a really exciting place to live. And in many ways, it was the beginning of what you might call modern historiography in the Adventist Church. And a great many of the historians who have worked in the field since were there at Andrews at the time. Gary Land, Eric Anderson, Ben MacArthur, John Butler, Ronald Numbers. These were all either colleagues or students or seminary students who were friends. Roy Branson was there. Spectrum was founded. And the 70s were a really pivotal decade in Adventist historiography. Tremendous amount of work done there. And in fact, there really wasn't another generation of Adventist historians, I think, until the last 10 or 15 years. The 80s, 90s, not a lot of action. But in more recent decades, once again, thanks to George Knight and others, there has been a flowering, I think, of research and publication in Adventist history, though there are still just enormous gaps.
Yeah. Well, this kind of is a natural segue because, I think the article you're most famous for, the first article I ever read by you is this article that you eventually delve into the French Revolution. Kind of tell us that next step, because you do go back and study what Ellen White writes about the Great Controversy, right?
Yes. What happened at Andrews was that there was a tremendous intellectual ferment in the 70s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The Adventist Church had created a university. What did that mean? And there were a large number of young PhDs on campus, PhDs who had been trained at premier universities around the country. And we were all talking to each other. And these conversations came up. And in fact, in my own teaching, I had students, raising questions because I was teaching English history, as well as, world civilization and French Revolution. And you might recall, you wouldn't recall, you all are too young, but when Spectrum came out in a very early, I think maybe in the very first number, Roy Branson and Harold Weiss wrote an article calling for research into Adventist history, and specifically into Ellen White.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of interest. And it's a long story, and I don't want to take a lot of time, but as a result of my reading in preparation for my courses in British history, I did some reading on the English Reformation from a modern historian, and it was very much focused on the religious changes that had been taking place. And it described the English Reformation as really a religious movement. And, the view that I'd been raised with was, it's all about Henry VIII and his wives, and, it's all about economics and sort of a secular explanation. And I found that very interesting. And I thought, well, Ellen White was right on that. So I first started researching Ellen White's, dealing with the English Reformation, and discovered that she had taken it all from D'Aubigné. And so then I decided to do another sample, and I picked the Bohemian Reformation, John Huss, and again lined up, in this case, double columns, and discovered that she had taken that almost entirely from James A. Wiley's History of Protestantism. And meanwhile, I was having conversations with colleagues. My colleague, Bill Peterson, ended up writing a very interesting article on Ellen White's use of history in her accounts of the French Revolution. And there was just a lot of action going on at the time. So I think my real and probably only serious contribution to Adventist history was the manuscript I prepared called Ellen White and the Protestant Historians, which has never been published. It's about 300 pages long, and it lines up the source, Wiley, with the original handwritten holograph that Ellen White wrote in her own hand, and then on the third column, what was published in Great Controversy. And what's really interesting there is not only the borrowing, the sequence, but also the fact that her literary assistant, Marion Davis, felt the freedom to delete large portions of what Ellen White had written and add additional portions directly from Wiley. I'm not talking about just sentences here or there, but paragraphs, pages. And so I realized that both Ellen White and her assistant both understood that Ellen White was not writing stuff that she had seen first in vision and was just finding a historian who had worded it artfully. Ellen White was perfectly happy with Marion Davis adding lots of new material from Wiley, and Marion Davis felt comfortable deleting material Ellen White had taken and adding additional material. The book was being prepared for publication to a non-Adventist audience. Colporteurs were going to sell it door to door, and both of them realized they wanted a book that would be readable and something that people would buy. And so I wrote that. And by the way, just as an aside, at last it is going to be published. Oak and Acorn Press in California has agreed to publish it, and I've been working on it in the last couple of years. It is going to be a vast improvement over the original paper, because it is the original paper, but it shows you the changes I made in the original paper at the request of the White estate. It also includes the publications by Arthur White, which were responding. And you might say that it shows that there was a very reluctant reception to my work. And the only reason I didn't publish it in the years that followed is that I had promised Arthur White, when he agreed to let me transcribe the Ellen White manuscript, the Huss manuscript, I had promised him that I wouldn't publish it. And I've kept my word. But I've gotten a release from the White estate now to publish it, and I found a publisher. And it's slow, but hopefully the book will come out in a year or so, and hopefully people will read it and once and for all understand how Ellen White used historians and why her use of historians was not inconsistent with her claims. However, quite inconsistent with many of the claims made about her work by her son, W.C. White, and by the church generally right up through the 1970s. And I'm not sure if the church has yet generally recognized the fact that Ellen White is not an authority on history, and you can't cite her writings to prove a historical point one way or the other.
I have dug around and I was looking at some of the big articles and papers that you've been writing, Dr. Adams, and that was the one that honestly caught my attention the most. I saw it referenced in a couple different areas, and I'd love to hear a little bit. What do you think has kept the reception of this kind of an idea that Ellen White is not a historical source that she never claimed to be? What do you think has kept that from being welcomed by the church at large?
I think it's the issue of authority. I grew up in Tacoma Park, Maryland. My father was a general conference officer, director of the publishing department. I was, the Adventist church is like my extended family. And I was raised very firmly with the view that everything Ellen White said was authoritative. Her comments on science, on, family relationships, on religious theological points, on history, everything was authoritative. And in any kind of a discussion, if there was a question, people would say, well, here's what Ellen White says, end of discussion. No one felt comfortable saying, well, maybe she was wrong. So when I wrote that paper, it was clear to anybody who would just read it with any kind of care that she was not an authority on history. And if she's not an authority on history, it raises the question, well, maybe she's also not an authority on science. And, where does that end? And I think that issue of authority is the issue that really stuck. So when the White estate and the official church responded, I thought, my view was not that I had a problem. My view is that the church had a problem, and I was presenting them with a solution to that problem. And that is to go back and look at Ellen White's own behavior and her own comments at the time. And I will say, I think she was sometimes a little less candid in admitting how dependent she was on sources, but that's a very human thing to do. I thought that once this evidence was there, the church would take the lead in gradually educating its membership, but it did not. The 1919 Bible Conference was a missed opportunity to educate the church. The church leaders at the time understood the reality. The church backed away from that because it was afraid that it would, stir up too much hostility, I suppose, from the, if I might call it, the right wing of the church. And then there was another opportunity in the 70s, and it wasn't just my work; it was Ronald Numbers. There were a lot of people writing Ellen White studies in the 70s, and the church had a second opportunity to begin to educate its membership as to the reality of her gift. Inspiration is a word. How do you define it? Well, I think you have to define it with the facts that are established. And the church backed away from it that time too. And in the book that I'm going to publish, you will see my paper in its context, as well as the church response. And you will see that the church leaders were admitting as little as they possibly could in the most guarded and opaque language, and then dropping the subject completely. And now, here, almost another 50 years later, if you think about it, it was about 50 years from the 1919 Bible Conference to the 70s. It's about almost another 50 years from the 70s to now. And once again, this issue is coming up. I think the direction was pointed really by George Knight in his book, Ellen White's Afterlife, in which he really documents very clearly the view her contemporaries had and the view that was propagated in the Adventist church after she died. And, by the way, historically, this is not that unusual. Movements frequently take the founding generation and raise it on a high pedestal to justify their legitimacy. You can see this in the Soviet Union. After Lenin dies, what does the Communist Party do? They make him practically a saint, build a mausoleum, quote him constantly. It's a way to legitimize things. And so the hagiography, if I can, about Ellen White was something that I think the generation of the teens and 20s and 30s felt it was important to do to legitimize the gift and her role in the church. But it's unnecessary. So I think authority is the key word there. And I think that's a challenge for scientists, theologians, and others. It's not my problem as a historian. But as a historian, I can affirm pretty confidently that Ellen White is not an authority. She not only admitted that, she stated it as such. She acknowledges it in a paragraph in the opening of the 1888 Great Controversy, and the evidence is simply unimpeachable.
Yeah.
I appreciate the fact that you boil this down to the idea of authority, and I think you're right on. I'm thinking as a pastor here in this moment, and I'm trying to ask, why is there such a hesitancy on the part of church officials, church publications, estates, whatever, to admit that Ellen White never claimed authority on history or science or whatever? And I'm thinking, even in my own church evangelistic campaigns, when presenting, the idea of the spirit of prophecy or anything like that, the people who are coming into the church, new, fresh believers, are being told and taught that Ellen White is an authority and that they should change their lifestyle based on certain ideas that she's promoted. What do we do, when our evangelism is saying one thing to new believers, and then all of a sudden we get them in and we're like, oh, hey, actually, you've done all this stuff to change your life, but we're really not sure she's an authority. Like, how do we balance those two things?
Well, that is the dilemma, I think, faced in 1919, and it's an issue we need to work through. But let me say, I'm not knowledgeable about what is being taught children in Adventist elementary schools and high schools today. It's been a long time since I've had that, a source of information. And I'm not knowledgeable about what is being taught by evangelists when they hold series. But if they are putting forward Ellen White as an authority, they are making a mistake. It is appropriate to present Ellen White as a messenger of the Lord, as someone with a gift, as God used prophets of old in key moments in history to, rebuke or lead the people. Ellen White was a very necessary person in the founding of the Adventist Church. It wouldn't have existed without her, I don't believe. And she is extremely valuable in many ways, historically and inspirationally and devotionally. But we've learned a lot about how the world works, and we've learned a lot about history in the more than 100 years since she died. And to think that she is going to be an authority on these matters is simply why would one think she's an authority on these matters? It's creating an expectation that is not needed and is in fact misleading.
No, I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, coming back to 1919, it seems to me that you're talking about putting Ellen White on a pedestal, and then also this sort of, I call it like a tidal wave of fundamentalism that comes and sweeps the church in the wake of the 1919 Bible Conference, and as you point out, sort of like this missed opportunity. But this has been also kind of the struggle of Adventism through the 20th century, hasn't it? Is how do we actually, as Greg said, in terms of authority and this kind of struggle, and George Knight's described that very well in his book. This seems to be like a tension that has existed and continues to exist, this kind of struggle, right? Am I on track here?
Yes, and I think it's important for people to realize that as important as Ellen White is for the founding of Adventism, she's not the only one.
Yeah.
The Adventist Church is a lot bigger than Ellen White. She herself made a point of saying that I only affirm what the brethren in study have already taken from Scripture. My role is to affirm that. I don't originate it. And I think that's one of the tremendous values of Adventist history, is we see how rich the texture is. We would have also had a hard time getting a church off the ground without John Evans Andrews. I think Gil Valentine's book on Andrews is really a magnificent study. And it shows you some of Andrew's conflicts with Ellen White. She needed him just as he needed her.
Yeah. And
he was a very significant figure. Of course, James was perhaps the most significant figure early on. And Uriah Smith, a host of others. That's one reason the series of Adventist pioneers that George Knight has shepherded is so valuable. It helps us realize that this was a community effort. There were a lot of people involved, people that are not known so much by the average Adventist today, but I had the privilege of doing a little research on E.R. Palmer and C.H. Jones, really magnificent contributors to the Adventist Church. And that's one reason I'm so interested in fostering research and publication in Adventist history. I think as we understand the full church, not just in the 19th century, which is mostly where the historical work has been done to date, but we have the whole 20th century. And, there hasn't been nearly as much historical writing on the 20th century as I think there should be. Also, we need to broaden, as historians, we need to broaden our scope, as I tried to point out in the paper I wrote for the Adventist historians sometime back, several years back. We need to broaden our approach, not just to using narrative history, but using the full toolkit that is now available to us as historians. Historians in the 20th century have gone way beyond just writing narrative history. Narrative history is still appropriate and it's the most fun to read. But putting history in its broadest context and analyzing the various forces at work is something that we need to do in Adventist history. We need to put Adventist history in context.
Yeah, I share
there are, as a historian, I will say there are three things that we can use to try to understand the past. One is human agency. Humans make history by what they say, what they think, what they do, right? That's important. Another thing is context, the context in which they do it. And the broader the context, the more one understands. The context includes everything from the climate to the sociology of the period, the diseases that were flourishing, the technology of the period, what was going on in the larger society, what was going on in the larger world. I mean, an example of the importance of context is we talk a lot today about the history of slavery in the United States. Very important topic. How often do we talk about that in the context of slavery worldwide? Since the beginning of civilization, right on down through the 19th century, practiced almost everywhere. When you understand the U.S. slavery experience and the total context of slavery, it's a different picture. When you understand the Adventist Church in the context of its time and place, it illuminates significantly what is going on. So context is a very important point of understanding history. And then, of course, there's always what historians call contingency or luck. Sometimes things just happen. They're small things, but there's the butterfly effect. And there's no control over that. Who dies at an inappropriate time? What storm causes a battle to go the other way? There is chance in history. And I think historians need to understand all of these, and we need to bring all of these insights into our study of our Adventist past.
Don, listening to these three different things, I guess I have two questions. We're going to, I'm sure, have some people that are aspiring historians will listen to this. And I'd love to hear you just kind of reflect a little bit about where you would like to see future historians. Say a PhD student comes to you now and says, Don, I love your scholarship that you've done, but where do you see Adventist history moving into the future? You see how this sort of second wave of historians under George Knight and others in more recent years has really caused a flowering of history. So that's my first question. My second question is, this whole idea of contingency, of chance in history, does that seem to threaten a certain mindset that everything has to be providential? As if, and I wonder if we've almost gone into like Calvinism, into this predeterminism within some circles of Adventism. Everything is predetermined by God. And when maybe that really isn't the case. And I wonder if we need to draw more in our Arminian heritage that it's okay that not everything is divine providence. So I guess two questions, in whichever order you want to tackle those.
Well, on the first question, I do hope that young people will, at least a certain number, will pursue careers as historians, and specifically historians of Adventism. Mm-hmm. The historical profession has fallen on hard times in recent years, I think. You can see the number of history majors declining in universities and colleges. It does not lead to lucrative employment in most cases, but there is a need, and I hope that need is met in the Adventist Church for young students, bright students, people with real talent and dedication to go into history as a profession. It is a lot of fun, and it is very rewarding, and the church needs that. The historians may actually do more good for the Adventist Church in many cases than the preachers, because they keep us focused on reality, and they help us understand our past. And you can't really understand the present you're in if you don't have some knowledge of how you got here. So that's my first point, and I hope that is happening. I don't know that it is. We don't need the focus on the Adventist past to just come in a few waves. A big wave in the 70s and early 80s, and then another wave in the last 20 years. We need this to be an ongoing, continuous field of research and study. Yeah. And the church archives are really a fantastic resource. And there's a lot of history. It's a global movement. There's history in every continent, Adventist history on every continent. Mm-hmm. So that's my comment on your first question. Your second point about what should I say, providence or even predestination. I consider the future to be open. Yeah. And I do. If it is all predetermined, what role is left for me as an individual? Why did God make me as an individual with judgment and
back to agency?
The opportunity to agency, right? How if it's all been done and set, and we're just waiting to watch it happen, we're bystanders instead of participants. And I'm not a theologian. I think Rick Bryce and others have explored some of these points, but I think the future is open. Mm-hmm. And I think, in fact, there's some evidence for that, and that is that the Christians have been talking about the future ever since the ministry of Jesus himself, and they haven't gotten it right yet. Mm. The evidence is that notwithstanding numerous prophecies and hopes, we are still here. And so I think there's evidence that it's open, in addition to the fact that sort of philosophically it makes sense to me that it must be open. And so how it all ends, I have views that are general, but they're not specific. If you read the last chapters in Great Controversy, the end time is all happening in the United States. And it's all happening when Protestantism and Catholicism are in a sort of a death struggle. I wonder what sense that makes to someone living in the 21st century in the Middle East or in China. So it seems to me we have to be open. And I think philosophically, that's where I am. Yeah.
I appreciate that very much. Greg, do you have a question? I know you've got a class in a little bit, so.
Yeah. I've actually, I was kind of wondering, just from your own perspective, you've had a chance to see a lot of stuff going on in the last 50 years of Adventist history and all the different twists and turns. What do you think is maybe the most impacting elements over these last years for historians in the church? And where do you think we could head in terms of research to make at least comparable impact in the future?
Well, that's a hard question. I really don't know what is available in the General Conference archives, but I know there is a huge amount of material there. And there are also collections now at PUC and at Andrews and other places. I think Adventists are much more inclined to keep records. I myself have deposited a bunch of my records with the Southwestern Adventist University Library. In case anyone ever wants to write a history of the college, there's going to be some information they might find useful. So there's a lot there, but it seems to me like the big themes that dominate the 20th century that Adventist historians should be looking at. One of these big themes is the world church. It's not just an American church anymore. It's a world church.
Mm-hmm.
And that creates all kinds of really big challenges, which historians need to try to help us understand. It's not just a matter of looking at how it stands today, but how we sort of evolved into this. And in some ways, we have the same problem that the Catholic Church has. If you're a world church, can you be the exact same everywhere? Mm. And I think the Catholic Church figured out as early as the Counter-Reformation and the Spanish conquest of the Indies, that a world church cannot be exactly the same place everywhere in the world. It's going to be different. Mm. And if you try to make it exactly the same everywhere, what you will have is division. You will have separation. So I think a central question for Adventism today is, what is the core that is the defining principles that make Adventism Adventism, and what is the area of variety where different forms and different practices can fit into. And I think that is a tension right now facing the church leadership. How tight do you try to govern it? And what is the risk of governing it too tightly? How loose can you allow it to be? And what is the risk of allowing it to be too loose? Mm. And I don't know what the answer to that question is, but it's an important question for the current leaders. And it's a question Adventist historians can start looking at as the church became a world church, because it's been becoming a world church now for many decades. And you can see that when I was young, in the overseas divisions, the union presidents were usually Americans. That ended even when I was young. The local population said, look, we're going to have a president in Brazil who's a Brazilian, and we're going to have a president in, Kenya who's a Kenyan. We want to run our own church. The transition into a world church has been going on for quite a while. I think it's a really interesting theme to study. I think another really strong theme is the stream of context. Look at the American church. Has it been immune from all of the social movements that have been sweeping the country in the last 20 years? Women's rights, gay rights. I could make a list. Is the American church today woke, or is it not? Or is it woke some places and not woke other places? Whatever woke means, by the way. I'm not sure. But context. The Adventist church does not exist in a vacuum. Adventists read the same newspapers. They watch a lot of the same television shows. They eat at the same restaurants. They are part of American culture. Mm-hmm. And you can certainly see the impact of cultural change on the church. And that's something that needs to be studied, needs to be understood. Yeah. It's a challenge for leadership, but historians have something to contribute to understanding that. And that's just one example of context. So I think that's a second really big theme for Adventist historians to study. And then, of course, there's just the internal politics of the church. Every organization has politics. And politics is not a bad word, right? It's an ancient Greek word, the life of the city, the polis. So there's politics in the Adventist church. And understanding that helps you understand why this person's in charge here and this person's in charge here, and this hospital is built here, and this institution becomes a university, and this institution changes its name. There are things going on, and these are interesting, and they're important to understand. And I'm sure the archives are full of information that make that maybe the easiest of these three areas to study. Mm-hmm. but I think that these are all big themes that deserve the attention of Adventist historians.
Now,
That's great. I love that you bring this up, the international context, because that is the church today. We can't pretend that we're just a North American church with any sort of primacy or priority at this point anymore.
that disappeared over a century ago in the mid 1920s, when there were more Adventists outside of North America than there were inside North America. So in terms of our historiography, we really need to catch up to that. And as I was listening to you, Dr. McAdams, it reminded me of, like, for example, all of the discussions in early Adventism on giving and systematic benevolence and tithe. Every one of them happened in the midst of a major financial recession. So we like to talk about these discussions as if they, just happened, but they happened in context, and appreciate that very much. Our time's just about up for today, but if you were to go back and do something different, or maybe study something a little bit more in depth, or change something, I know that we're not into changing history, but just as an act of self-reflection, here you are in the midst of a very fertile time in the 60s and 70s with your own scholarship, working with other, very bright minds that contributed to this sort of awakening in historiography. Any self-reflection on anything you do differently, or pay attention to a little differently, or pursue in your own historiography?
Well, I will say it was a privilege, and in some ways an honor, certainly an inspiration, to not only know but be good friends with Ron Numbers and Ron Graybill and Roy Branson and John Butler. I could go on. Gil Valentine, Ben MacArthur. This generation of Adventist historians was an interesting group, and I think made really significant contributions. And I'm proud to have been a part of that. It was a good part of my life. I should point out that Adventist history is not really my specialty. My specialty is British history. And although from 1984 until today, I have not been making a living as a professional historian, I have still continued to read a lot of history. And I have read lots of history, mostly European history, mostly British history, and a little bit of American history as well. So I know way more about that than I do about Adventist history. I don't really consider myself a significant Adventist historian. I wrote a couple of interesting articles in Spectrum. I think my look at changing views of inspiration that was published at the end of the 70s was I think it's been the most cited thing I've written in Adventist history. But really, most of my career as a historian has been, British history, European history. And in fact, I've made my living since 1984 doing other things. The books I've written are on education policy. 4 books on education policy published by Columbia and Harvard. They have nothing to do with Adventism. So when you ask about second thoughts, I probably should have spent more time continuing to pursue Adventist history than I did. But I really have no second thoughts. I've had a great life. I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed everything I've done. I've tried to make the world a better place wherever I am. But I think that the most significant contribution that I have made in the long run will be what I have written, because that will survive me. And I do hope that that in some ways maybe I can be an example to younger historians to really focus on writing and publishing good Adventist history.
Well, thank you, Dr. McAdams. We're going to put a wrap for today's episode. We appreciate your scholarship and your time to just share with us very candidly about your own experience, and that has helped to guide you. So I want to thank our listeners for joining us. This is Michael Campbell and Greg Howell with the Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast. Join us again each month as we explore new contours in our Adventist past.
And Jesus himself said that he did not come to do away with the law.
He will not take us out of this world if he does not want us to be contaminated by it.
The Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast is part of the Adventist History Podcast Network. You can find other podcasts, as well as additional content from this podcast, by following us on YouTube and Facebook. If you'd like to support this show or others on the Adventist History Podcast Network, please visit patreon.com/Adventist History Podcast. Enjoy the show.